Brussels, 1943. A funeral procession moves slowly through the cobblestone streets under the watchful eyes of German soldiers. Black fabric drapes the coffin. A nun walks beside it, her head bowed in prayer, rosary beads clicking softly between her fingers. The Nazi guards barely glance at her. After all, what threat could a bride of Christ pose to the Third Reich? But beneath the wooden lid of that coffin, wrapped in white burial cloth where a body should rest, sits 40 pounds of TNT. The nun's name is Sister Marie, and she is about to commit an act so audacious, so impossibly dangerous, that even the hardened men of the Belgian resistance questioned her sanity. This is the story they buried in the footnotes of history. This is the story of the woman who turned funeral rites into weapons deliveries, who transformed sacred ceremonies into acts of war, and who understood that the Nazis would never suspect that death itself could be a cover for rebellion. By the end of this video, you will discover how one woman's faith became the perfect disguise for one of the most brazen smuggling operations in occupied Europe. Belgium in 1940 had become a nation, suffocated by the iron grip of Nazi occupation. 4 years into the occupation, the streets of Brussels had transformed into a surveillance state where every corner held a checkpoint, every face was suspect, and every movement was monitored. The Gestapo had infiltrated neighborhoods with informants. Collaborators whispered names to the authorities for extra rations or protection. The Jewish population had been systematically hunted, rounded up, and shipped east to camps whose true purpose was only whispered about in the darkest hours of night. Resistance fighters operated in the shadows, desperately trying to organize, to strike back, to remind the occupiers that Belgium had not surrendered its soul, even if its government had fled. But resistance required weapons, guns, explosives, ammunition. And the Nazis had locked down every supply route into and out of the city with a network of checkpoints so thorough that smuggling a single pistol required weeks of planning and often ended in execution. The convents of Brussels had become unlikely sanctuaries in this new order. The Germans, despite their contempt for many institutions, maintained a cautious respect for the Catholic Church. Nuns moved through the city with relative freedom compared to ordinary citizens. They tended to the sick, buried the dead, and maintained the rituals of faith that even war could not completely extinguish. The Nazis calculated that these women in black habits posed no tactical threat. They were keepers of the old world, relics of a softer time, focused on the next life rather than this one. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. What the occupiers failed to understand was that faith and resistance were not opposites. For many of these women, defying evil was itself a sacred duty. The convent walls that appeared to shelter them from the war actually concealed networks of information, safe houses for Jews and Allied pilots, and a growing determination to fight back by any means necessary. Sister Marie had not always been a smuggler. Before the war, she had been a teacher at the convent school, known for her gentle manner with children and her beautiful singing voice during Mass. She came from a working-class family in the Flemish countryside, the daughter of a coal miner who had died of black lung when she was 12. She entered the convent at 18, seeking purpose and community in service to God. Her life had been predictable, peaceful, defined by prayer schedules and lesson plans. Then came May 1940. The German blitzkrieg tore through Belgium in 18 days. She watched from the convent windows as tanks rolled through streets where children had played. She heard the stories of massacres, of families torn apart, of a darkness descending that seemed to have no bottom. Something hardened inside her during those early months of occupation. Faith, she realized, was not passive acceptance. It was active love. And love, real love, sometimes required you to pick up the sword, or in her case, to hide explosives in coffins meant for the dead. The Belgian resistance had approached the convent in the spring of 1942. They needed a solution to an impossible problem. British intelligence was airdropping weapons and explosives into the countryside, but moving those materials into Brussels meant crossing dozens of checkpoints where German soldiers searched every vehicle, every cart, every suspicious bundle. Standard smuggling routes had been compromised. Too many good people had been caught, tortured, executed. They needed something the Nazis would never search. Someone suggested the dead. Funeral processions moved through checkpoints with minimal inspection. The Germans, superstitious despite their ideology, seemed uncomfortable disturbing the dead, and the religious element provided additional cover. Would a soldier really force open a coffin being transported by grieving nuns? The plan was insane. It was also brilliant, but they needed someone inside the convent, someone with access to the funeral rites. Someone brave enough, or perhaps faithful enough, to believe that God would forgive the deception if it meant saving lives. Mother Superior brought the proposal to Sister Marie in the garden behind the chapel, where the spring flowers were just beginning to bloom despite the war. The older nun explained the request carefully, offering Sister Marie every chance to refuse. This was not a command. This was a choice. Sister Marie listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the statue of the Virgin Mary at the garden's center. When Mother Superior finished, Sister Marie asked only one question: how many lives could they save? The answer was uncertain. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Every pound of explosive delivered to the resistance meant another bridge destroyed, another German convoy ambushed, another day the occupation's machinery was disrupted. Sister Marie nodded slowly. She would do it. Not despite her vows, but because of them. The next funeral would carry more than prayers. It would carry 40 pounds of death meant for those who had brought death to her country. The first coffin arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, delivered to the convent's rear entrance by two men Sister Marie had never seen before. They wore the clothes of undertakers, their faces carefully neutral, their movements efficient and practiced. They unloaded the pine box from their cart without ceremony, carried it into the storage room beside the chapel, and left without a word. Sister Marie waited until the sound of their horses' hooves faded on the cobblestones before approaching the coffin. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of white linen that mimicked burial shrouds, sat 6 canvas packages. She didn't need to unwrap them to know what they contained. The chemical smell of the explosives leaked through the fabric. This was real. This was happening. She was now part of the underground war, a soldier in a habit, and there was no turning back. The mechanics of the operation were deceptively simple. When a legitimate death occurred in the community, which happened with grim regularity in occupied Brussels, the convent would handle the funeral arrangements as they always had. But now, before the actual body was placed in the coffin, Sister Marie and one trusted colleague would create a false bottom. They would line the coffin with a thin wooden panel, creating a hidden compartment beneath where the deceased would rest. The explosives would be packed into this space, then sealed. The body would be positioned above, dressed and prepared according to Catholic tradition. To any observer, even one who looked inside, it would appear to be exactly what it was supposed to be: a person being prepared for Christian burial. The weight difference was negligible. The coffin would be nailed shut. The funeral procession would proceed through the streets of Brussels, passing through German checkpoints, where soldiers would see only grieving nuns accompanying the dead to their final rest. The route was always the same. The procession would leave the convent, move north through the city centre, and arrive at a cemetery on the outskirts where resistance fighters worked as gravediggers. These men would receive the coffin, lower it into a prepared grave while the nuns said prayers, and then, after the sisters departed, exhume it. They would extract the explosives, reseal the coffin with only the body inside, and bury it properly. The whole operation required split-second timing and absolute trust. If the nuns arrived late, the gravediggers might have already left, unable to risk staying too long in one place. If the Germans decided to inspect a coffin, everyone involved would face immediate execution. The Nazis had made their policy clear. Anyone caught aiding the resistance would be shot, their families arrested, their property seized. There would be no trials, no mercy, no exceptions. Sister Marie's role extended beyond the physical smuggling. She had to maintain absolute normalcy. She attended morning prayers with the other sisters, taught her classes at the convent school, tended to the sick in the infirmary. She could not appear distracted or nervous. She could not confide in anyone outside the small circle of nuns who knew the truth. Even within the convent, perhaps a dozen sisters out of nearly 60 were aware of what was happening in that storage room. The others lived in deliberate ignorance, protected by their lack of knowledge. If the Gestapo came, those who knew nothing could truthfully claim innocence. Sister Marie carried the weight of this secret like a stone in her chest. She prayed constantly, not just the scheduled prayers of religious life, but desperate, whispered conversations with God in the quiet moments between tasks. She asked for strength. She asked for forgiveness. She asked for the war to end before her luck ran out. The Nazi checkpoints became the crucible where her faith and her nerve were tested daily. The Germans had established security rings around Brussels, concentric circles of control that every person and vehicle had to pass through when moving between districts. At each checkpoint, soldiers examined papers, searched bags, questioned travelers about their destinations and purposes. The checkpoint on Rue de la Loi, which the funeral processions had to cross, was commanded by an Obersturmführer named Kruger, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who approached his duties with bureaucratic thoroughness. He knew the nuns by sight after months of their regular movements through his checkpoint. He had even attended a mass at the convent once, sitting in the back pew with his uniform pressed and his hands folded in what might have been prayer or might have been boredom. This familiarity was both protection and danger. He trusted them, which meant he rarely searched them thoroughly, but he also watched them, and any deviation from their normal patterns would draw his attention immediately. The first smuggling run happened on a humid afternoon in late June. An elderly woman from the parish had died of pneumonia, her body already prepared for burial by the time the resistance delivered their package to the convent. Sister Marie worked quickly in the dim light of the storage room, her hands steadier than she expected, as she and Sister Therese constructed the false bottom. They measured twice, cut once, fitting the thin panel of wood so precisely that even running a hand along the interior of the coffin revealed nothing suspicious. The explosives went in first, wrapped in oilcloth to mask any residual odor. Then the panel. Then the body of old Mrs. Duchamp dressed in her Sunday best, her hands crossed over her chest with a rosary woven between her fingers. Sister Marie whispered an apology to the deceased woman as they sealed the coffin. Mrs. Duchamp had been devout her entire life. Sister Marie chose to believe she would understand, would perhaps even approve of her final journey serving a greater purpose than her own rest. The procession assembled in the courtyard at 2 o'clock. 4 nuns, including Sister Marie, would accompany the coffin. 2 laymen from the parish served as pallbearers, neither aware of what they carried. The horse-drawn hearse waited with its black plumes swaying in the slight breeze. Sister Marie took her position at the front left of the procession, her prayer book open, her voice leading the others in the recitation of the rosary. Her throat felt dry despite the humidity. Her heartbeat hammered in her ears so loudly she worried the others might hear it. But her voice remained steady. Hail Mary, full of grace. The procession moved forward. The blessed art thou among women. The iron wheels of the hearse clattered on the stones. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. They turned onto Rue de la Loi, and ahead she could see the checkpoint. The red and black barrier lowered across the road, the soldiers in their grey-green uniforms watching their approach with expressions of practiced indifference. Obersturmführer Kruger stepped forward as they reached the barrier. He raised one hand in a gesture that was part greeting, part command to halt. Sister Marie felt her legs weaken, but forced herself to keep walking until she stood directly before him. He nodded respectfully, his eyes moving over the procession, counting the nuns, noting the hearse. He spoke in German-accented French, his voice flat and administrative. "Who has died?" Sister Marie responded that it was Mrs. Duchamp, a parishioner of 78 years taken by illness, being transported to the cemetery for burial according to the rites of the church. Kruger nodded again. He had heard this explanation dozens of times before. He glanced at the coffin, then back at Sister Marie. His eyes were unreadable behind those wire-rimmed glasses. For a terrible moment, she thought he would order his men to open it. Her mind raced through impossible scenarios. Would she confess immediately to spare the others? Would she run? Would she pray? Kruger stepped back and waved them through. The barrier lifted with a metallic screech. The procession moved forward. Sister Marie did not allow herself to breathe fully until they were 50 meters past the checkpoint, until the sounds of German voices faded behind them. Her hands shook so violently that she had to clasp them together to hide the tremor. Sister Therese, walking beside her, caught her eye and gave the slightest nod. They had done it. The first delivery was successful, but this was only the beginning. The resistance needed more, much more. And each subsequent run would carry the same paralyzing risk, the same moment of standing before German soldiers, with death hidden beneath the veneer of religious ritual, waiting to see if this would be the time their luck failed, the time the coffin was opened, the time everything ended. The cemetery exchange happened exactly as planned. The grave diggers received the coffin with appropriate solemnity, lowered it into the earth while the nuns recited final prayers, and then bowed their heads as the sisters departed. Sister Marie didn't look back. She couldn't. Any deviation from normal behavior might draw attention from observers she couldn't see. The walk back to the convent felt longer than the journey out, her body heavy with exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical exertion. When they finally passed through the convent gates, when the heavy wooden doors closed behind them, Sister Marie went directly to the chapel. She knelt before the altar and wept silently, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. She didn't know if she was crying from relief, from fear, from the weight of what she had just done, or from the knowledge that she would have to do it again, and again, and again, until the war ended, or until the Nazis discovered what she was doing and put a bullet in her head. Summer turned to autumn and the coffins kept moving. By September of 1943, Sister Marie had made 11 successful runs through the checkpoints. The routine became almost mechanical, though the fear never diminished. Each time she approached Obersturmführer Kruger's barrier, her body responded with the same physical terror. The racing heart, the cold sweat, the sensation that her legs might give out beneath her. But she learned to function through the fear, to let her voice remain calm while her insides churned, to meet the German officer's eyes without flinching. The resistance had increased their requests. What had started as occasional deliveries now happened twice weekly, sometimes more. The hidden compartments in the coffins grew more sophisticated. Sister Therese, who had worked as a carpenter's daughter before taking her vows, designed panels that were nearly invisible, even upon close inspection. They varied the route slightly, alternating between two different cemeteries to avoid establishing too predictable a pattern, but always they had to pass through Kruger's checkpoint. There was no other way north through the city. The close calls began in October. A young German soldier new to Kruger's unit decided to be thorough during one inspection. He walked around the hearse, peering underneath the carriage, checking the wheels. Then he approached the coffin itself. Sister Marie's blood turned to ice as he placed his hand on the wooden lid, as if testing its weight. He looked at Kruger and said something in rapid German that she couldn't fully understand. Kruger responded sharply, his tone carrying clear irritation. The young soldier stepped back, chastened. Kruger turned to Sister Marie and apologized for the delay with a tight smile. New recruits, he explained in French, sometimes forgot that even in war some things remained sacred. The procession was allowed to continue. But that night, Sister Marie couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed in the dormitory, listening to the breathing of the other sisters, replaying those terrible seconds when the soldier's hand rested on the coffin. How much pressure would it have taken for him to notice the weight distribution was wrong? How close had they come to discovery? The resistance, meanwhile, was putting the explosives to devastating use. Sister Marie heard reports through the network's whispers. A German ammunition depot outside the city had been destroyed in a massive explosion that lit up the night sky. A railway bridge used to transport troops east had been blown, disrupting supply lines for weeks. A Gestapo headquarters in Antwerp had been bombed, killing 3 high-ranking officers. Each success meant more Nazi reprisals. The occupiers responded to resistance actions with brutal efficiency. For every German killed, they executed 10 Belgian civilians. The bodies of these victims were displayed in public squares as warnings. Sister Marie wrestled with the moral arithmetic of her actions. The explosives she smuggled saved Allied lives, disrupted the Nazi war machine, gave hope to occupied Belgium. But they also triggered retributions that killed innocents. She brought this torment to confession, speaking in careful abstractions to the elderly priest who served the convent. He listened in silence, then reminded her that evil flourished when good people did nothing. Inaction, he said, was also a choice. His absolution did little to ease her conscience, but it gave her enough strength to continue. November brought the first snow and a new complication. The Gestapo had begun investigating the resistance network, following threads that led uncomfortably close to the convent. 2 of the gravediggers who received the coffins were arrested after a raid on a resistance safe house. Under torture, there was always the risk they would talk, would reveal the cemetery connection, would expose the funeral operation. Sister Marie waited for the knock on the convent door that would mean discovery. Days passed, then weeks. The gravediggers, she later learned, had died under interrogation without revealing anything. Their sacrifice bought the operation time, but it also meant finding new contacts at the cemeteries, rebuilding trust with strangers, increasing the points of vulnerability. The network adapted. New gravediggers were recruited. The deliveries continued, but the margins of safety grew thinner with each passing week. By December, Sister Marie had smuggled more than 400 pounds of explosives into Brussels. The number felt abstract, disconnected from reality. 400 pounds, enough to level buildings, enough to kill hundreds. She tried not to think about it in those terms, tried to focus instead on the lives potentially saved, the Nazi operations disrupted, the message sent that Belgium had not surrendered. But late at night, in the silence of the dormitory, the weight of those numbers pressed down on her. She was 32 years old. She had imagined dying peacefully as an old woman, surrounded by her sisters in faith, slipping quietly into the next world after a life of service and prayer. Now she imagined dying against a wall, blindfolded, hearing the command to fire in German. She prayed for courage. She prayed for the war to end. She prayed for forgiveness for the lives her actions had taken, directly or indirectly. And then each morning she rose and prepared to do it all again. The winter of 1943 brought a brutal cold that froze the streets of Brussels and turned the convent into a drafty stone icebox. But the freezing temperatures created an unexpected advantage for the smuggling operation. The Germans, even the disciplined soldiers at the checkpoints, wanted to spend as little time as possible in the bitter wind. Inspections became faster, more cursory. Soldiers huddled in their guard posts, emerging only briefly to check papers before waving people through. Obersturmführer Krüger himself seemed less inclined to linger in conversation. He would glance at the funeral procession, recognize Sister Marie's face and raise the barrier without questions. The cold was miserable, but it was also cover. Sister Marie began to time the funeral processions for the coldest parts of the day, early morning or late afternoon, when the wind cut through clothing and the soldiers were most eager to return to their heated stations. The resistance took advantage, increasing delivery requests. Some weeks saw 4 coffins pass through the checkpoints, each one carrying its deadly cargo beneath the bodies of the genuinely deceased. But familiarity bred its own dangers. By January of 1944, Sister Marie had made the journey so many times that the route had become automatic. She knew every crack in the cobblestones, every turn, every face at the checkpoint. She recognized individual soldiers, knew which ones were meticulous and which ones were lazy, which ones might make eye contact, and which ones stared straight ahead. This familiarity created a dangerous sense of routine, a feeling that the operation had become safe through repetition. Sister Therese warned her about this complacency during one of their late-night sessions preparing a coffin. They could not afford to relax. The moment they stopped being afraid was the moment they would make a mistake. Sister Marie knew she was right, but the human mind could only sustain maximum alertness for so long. After dozens of successful runs, the body began to treat danger as normal. The adrenaline responses dulled, the hypervigilance faded. She found herself going through the motions almost mechanically, her prayers recited by habit rather than conscious thought. Her interactions with Krüger following a script both of them knew by heart. The resistance network itself was changing. The early members, the careful planners who had recruited Sister Marie, were being arrested or killed at an alarming rate. New faces appeared with new requests, younger men with less patience and more recklessness. They pushed for larger deliveries, heavier explosives, faster turnarounds. Sister Marie found herself arguing with contacts she barely knew. insisting that the operation's success depended on maintaining its careful pace, its attention to detail, its respect for the limits of what could be hidden in a coffin without arousing suspicion. But the war was entering a new phase. The Allies had landed in Italy. The Eastern Front was collapsing for Germany. The resistance could sense that liberation might be possible, might be close, and they wanted to accelerate the pressure on the occupiers. Sister Marie understood their urgency, but urgency led to mistakes, and mistakes in this business meant death. The breaking point came on a grey morning in February. The resistance delivered a package to the convent that was larger than anything Sister Marie had handled before. 60 pounds of plastic explosives, more than had ever been hidden in a single coffin. Sister Therese examined the package and shook her head. It was too much. The weight would be noticeably different. The bulk would require a deeper false bottom, which meant less space for the body, which meant the deception would be more obvious to anyone who looked closely. But the resistance contact, a hard-eyed man in his early 20s, insisted. They needed this delivery for a major operation. A German general would be traveling through Brussels in 3 days. The explosives were intended for the bridge his convoy would cross. This was a chance to strike a significant blow. Sister Marie looked at the package, then at Sister Therese, then at the young man who stared at her with an expression that mixed desperation and demand. She made a decision that went against every instinct of caution she had developed. She agreed to take it. The preparation took twice as long as usual. The false bottom had to be reinforced to support the additional weight. The body, a middle-aged man who had died of typhus, had to be positioned carefully to distribute the mass evenly. Sister Marie worked through the night, her fingers numb from the cold and from anxiety. When dawn came and the procession assembled, she felt a premonition so strong it was almost physical. A voice in her head screaming that this was wrong, that this was the run that would end in disaster. But the hearse was already loaded. The other nuns were in position. The pallbearers waited. There was no turning back without drawing questions she couldn't answer. Sister Marie took her place at the front of the procession, opened her prayer book with hands that trembled visibly, and began to walk toward Kruger's checkpoint, carrying more death than she had ever carried before, knowing with terrible certainty that something was about to go horribly wrong. The procession moved through the morning fog like ghosts, the clip-clop of the horses' hooves echoing off the buildings. Sister Marie's prayers came automatically, words without thought, while her mind raced through scenarios of discovery and capture. The checkpoint appeared ahead through the mist, but something was different. There were more soldiers than usual. A military truck was parked beside the guard post. Officers stood in a cluster examining documents spread across the hood of a staff car. Sister Marie's stomach clenched. This was not the routine scene she had grown accustomed to. This was heightened security, probably in preparation for the general's visit that the resistance had mentioned. The worst possible timing for their heaviest load. She considered turning back, but that would draw even more suspicion. A funeral procession didn't simply reverse course. The dead had to be buried. She had no choice but to continue forward, into whatever waited at that barrier. Obersturmführer Kruger was not at his usual position. Instead, a senior officer Sister Marie had never seen before stood at the checkpoint, a Hauptsturmführer with cold blue eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He watched the procession approach with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When they reached the barrier, he stepped forward and spoke in clipped French. All vehicles and cargo were subject to enhanced inspection today. Security protocols had been elevated. He would need to see inside the coffin. The words hit Sister Marie like a physical blow. Her vision narrowed. The world seemed to tilt. Sister Therese, standing beside her, went completely still. This was it. This was the moment they had feared for 8 months. The moment when luck ran out, and the careful deception crumbled. Sister Marie's mind went blank, then flooded with a single desperate prayer. Not a prayer for escape, but a prayer for courage to face what was coming with dignity. She heard herself speaking, though the voice didn't sound like her own. She explained that opening the coffin would violate sacred burial practices, that the deceased had been prepared according to Catholic rites, that disturbing the dead was not only disrespectful, but potentially dangerous, given that the man had died of typhus. The disease was contagious. The body had been sealed quickly to prevent spread. The Hauptsturmführer listened to her explanation with an expression of complete indifference. He had his orders. Security came before superstition. He gestured to two soldiers who moved toward the hearse with crowbars. Sister Marie's legs nearly gave out. Sister Therese gripped her elbow, holding her upright. The pallbearers stepped back, confused and frightened. The soldiers wedged the crowbars under the coffin lid. The nails began to screech as they were pried loose. Sister Marie closed her eyes. In seconds, they would see the false bottom. They would discover the explosives, and then the executions would begin. A shout came from the guard post. One of the officers who had been examining documents was calling for the Hauptsturmführer, waving a paper urgently. The senior officer barked an order at the soldiers, who paused with the coffin half opened. He strode back to the staff car, clearly annoyed at the interruption. Sister Marie stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Through the gap in the coffin lid she could see the burial shroud, the edge of the dead man's shoulder. If the soldiers lifted the lid another few inches, if they looked down from the right angle, they might see the seam of the false bottom. Time stretched impossibly. She could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Sister Therese's shallow breathing, could hear the muffled conversation at the staff car. The Hauptsturmführer's voice rose in anger. Then he was striding back toward them, his face flushed. There had been a change, a security emergency elsewhere in the city. His unit was being redeployed immediately. He looked at Sister Marie, then at the partially opened coffin, then back at his waiting men. He made a decision with visible frustration. The funeral could proceed, but they were to go directly to the cemetery and return immediately. No delays. He would have soldiers follow them to ensure compliance. He snapped orders at his men, who reluctantly withdrew the crowbars and stepped back from the hearse. The coffin remained partially unsealed, several nails loose, the lid slightly askew. The Hauptsturmführer was already moving toward the military truck, shouting for his unit to mobilize. The barrier lifted. Sister Marie stood paralyzed until Sister Therese physically pushed her forward. "Move," the other nun whispered urgently. "Move now." The procession lurched into motion. Behind them, a military vehicle started its engine. Two soldiers climbed into the back, rifles across their laps. They were being followed. They were being watched. And the coffin was damaged, its seal broken, 60 pounds of explosives barely concealed beneath a lid that could shift with any bump in the road. Sister Marie began to pray in earnest, no longer reciting familiar words, but begging God for a miracle she no longer believed she deserved. The journey to the cemetery became a slow-motion nightmare. Every rut in the road threatened to shift the loosened coffin lid. Every turn risked exposing what lay beneath. Sister Marie walked at the front of the procession, her back rigid, forcing herself not to look at the hearse, not to glance back at the German truck that followed 20 meters behind. She could feel the soldiers' eyes on them, could imagine their fingers resting on their triggers, waiting for any sign of deception. The cemetery was only 12 blocks away, but each block felt like a kilometer. Her mind raced through impossible scenarios. When they reached the cemetery, the gravediggers would see the damaged coffin and know something had gone wrong. If the Germans were watching closely, if they saw the men's reactions, if they noticed anything unusual about how the burial was handled, the entire operation would collapse. She needed to warn the gravediggers somehow, needed to signal that this delivery was compromised, that they should abandon the pickup and bury the coffin as if it were legitimate. But how could she communicate that with soldiers watching their every move? They reached the cemetery gates as church bells struck 10 o'clock. The gravediggers were waiting, two men in work clothes leaning on shovels beside a freshly dug plot. Sister Marie caught the eye of the older one, a man named Laurent who had been part of the network since the beginning. She gave the slightest shake of her head, a movement so small it could have been mistaken for a shiver in the cold. Laurent's expression didn't change, but she saw understanding flicker in his eyes. He had noticed the German truck. He had seen the damaged coffin. He knew. The pallbearers carried the coffin from the hearse to the graveside, moving carefully to keep the loose lid from shifting. The soldiers remained in their truck, watching from a distance, but making no move to approach. Sister Marie began the burial prayers, her voice carrying across the frozen ground. The gravediggers lowered the coffin into the earth with ropes, the wood creaking ominously. Sister Marie's heart hammered as the coffin descended. If the lid came loose now, if it fell away and revealed the false bottom to the German observers, it would all end here. The coffin reached the bottom of the grave intact. Laurent and his partner began to shovel dirt, working with deliberate slowness, playing their roles as professional gravediggers who respected the solemnity of death. Sister Marie continued the prayers, drawing them out, giving the Germans no reason to suspect this was anything but a standard Catholic burial. 10 minutes passed. 20. The mound of earth grew over the coffin. Finally, it was done. Sister Marie made the sign of the cross over the grave, blessed the ground and turned to leave. The other nuns fell into formation behind her. They walked back toward the convent with the empty hearse, the German truck following like a predator, tracking wounded prey. Only when they were back within the convent walls, only when the heavy doors closed and the German truck drove away, did Sister Marie allow herself to collapse. She sank to her knees in the courtyard, her body shaking uncontrollably, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Sister Therese knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her shoulders. They had survived, impossibly, incredibly they had survived. But the explosives were still in the ground, buried under 6 feet of earth in a legitimate grave that the gravediggers couldn't exhume without drawing attention. 60 pounds of plastic explosives that the resistance desperately needed, that men had risked their lives to deliver, now lost. Sister Marie thought about the young contact who had insisted on this delivery, about the operation against the German general that would now have to be cancelled or delayed. She thought about the cost of this near disaster, the wasted resources, the missed opportunity. But she was also overwhelmed with a darker realization. They had been seconds from discovery. If that officer hadn't been called away, if those soldiers had lifted the lid just a few inches more, she would be in a Gestapo cell right now, facing interrogation and torture. The convent would have been raided. The other nuns would have been arrested. The entire network would have been compromised. All for 60 pounds of explosives that now sat uselessly in the earth. The operation had grown too ambitious, too reckless. Something had to change. That night, Sister Marie met with Mother Superior in the privacy of the Mother's chambers. She explained what had happened at the checkpoint, the near discovery, the damaged coffin, the burial of explosives that couldn't be recovered. Mother Superior listened in silence, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her expression grave. When Sister Marie finished, the older nun spoke quietly but firmly. The operation would continue, but on new terms. No more oversized loads, no more rushed deliveries. They would return to the careful protocols that had kept them safe for months, even if it meant disappointing the resistance contacts who demanded more and faster. The work was too important to jeopardize through recklessness. Sister Marie nodded, feeling both relief and a strange sense of loss. She had walked to the edge of the abyss and looked down into it. She had seen how easily everything could be destroyed, and yet, knowing all of this, knowing how close death had come, she also knew she would be back at the checkpoint within days. Another coffin on another hearse, because the alternative was surrender, and surrender was not something her faith would allow. Spring arrived in 1944 with rumors that carried more weight than the budding flowers in the convent garden. The Allies were planning something massive. The whispers spoke of an invasion, a landing somewhere on the French coast that would open a second front and turn the tide of the war. The resistance networks throughout occupied Europe were being activated, given orders to prepare for coordinated uprisings that would support the Allied advance. The explosives that Sister Marie had been smuggling for nearly 2 years would soon be put to their ultimate test. But the heightened activity also meant heightened danger. The Gestapo knew something was coming. They intensified their sweeps through Brussels, conducting random searches, arresting anyone remotely suspicious. The checkpoints became more thorough again. Obersturmführer Kruger, who had seemed almost friendly in his routine interactions with the funeral processions, now examined papers with renewed scrutiny. The brief window of complacency had closed. Every delivery became a calculated risk against an enemy that was increasingly paranoid and desperate. In early May, the resistance made their most audacious request yet. They needed Sister Marie to smuggle not just explosives, but a person. A British pilot had been shot down over Belgium and was hiding in a safe house that had been compromised. The Gestapo would raid it within days. The pilot needed to be moved to a new location, but every traditional escape route was being watched. Someone had proposed the unthinkable: hide the pilot in a coffin, transport him through the checkpoints as if he were dead, deliver him to the cemetery where resistance fighters could spirit him away to the countryside and eventually to Spain. Sister Marie listened to this plan with growing horror. Smuggling explosives was one thing. Smuggling a living human being, an enemy combatant, directly under Nazi noses was something else entirely. If discovered, there would be no possible excuse, no claim of innocence. This would be unambiguous treason. But the young pilot was 23 years old, someone's son fighting for the liberation of Europe. Leaving him to be captured and likely executed was unthinkable. She agreed, with one condition. This would be the last time. After this delivery, she would step back from the operation. She had pushed her luck too far for too long. Someone else would have to take over. The pilot arrived at the convent hidden in a delivery cart late one night. His name was Thomas, a RAF navigator from Yorkshire, with frightened eyes and a badly burned hand from his bailout. Sister Marie brought him to the storage room where so many coffins had been prepared. She explained what was about to happen. He would be placed in the coffin with enough air holes drilled through the wood to let him breathe. The journey would take approximately 1 hour. He would need to remain absolutely still, absolutely silent, even if the coffin was opened, even if he heard German voices, even if he felt the coffin being moved or tilted. Any sound, any movement, would mean death for everyone. Thomas nodded, his face pale in the candlelight. He understood. Sister Marie and Sister Therese prepared the coffin, lining it with blankets to provide some cushioning, drilling the air holes in a pattern that looked like wood grain damage. They positioned Thomas inside, his body curled to fit the confined space. Before they sealed the lid, Sister Marie placed a rosary in his hand. She told him to pray, not because she thought his Protestant prayers would reach her Catholic God, but because prayer would give him something to focus on, besides the suffocating darkness and the terror of his situation. The funeral procession the next morning was the most difficult Sister Marie had ever led. She could barely breathe thinking about Thomas locked in that box, his life completely dependent on her ability to maintain the deception. The weight of the coffin was noticeably different with a living person inside, but the pallbearers attributed it to their own exhaustion and said nothing. They reached Kruger's checkpoint just after dawn. The officer looked tired, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he had been on duty all night. He barely glanced at the procession, waving them through with a distracted gesture. But as they began to move forward, a motorcycle roared up to the checkpoint. A messenger in SS uniform dismounted and handed Kruger a dispatch. Sister Marie kept walking, kept praying, but watched from the corner of her eye as Kruger read the message. His expression changed. He looked up sharply, scanning the street. His eyes landed on the funeral procession. He raised his hand, commanding them to halt. Sister Marie's blood turned to ice. Kruger approached the hearse, the dispatch still in his hand. He addressed Sister Marie in French that was more formal than his usual casual tone. There had been reports of resistance activity in this district. All vehicles were subject to search. He would need to inspect the coffin. Sister Marie felt the world collapsing around her. Inside that wooden box, Thomas would be hearing this conversation. He would know what was about to happen. She imagined his terror, his desperate urge to move, to breathe too loudly, to betray himself. She started to protest, invoking the same arguments about sacred burial rites that had worked before, but Kruger cut her off. His orders were explicit, no exceptions. He gestured to 2 soldiers who moved toward the hearse with their rifles slung across their backs. They reached for the coffin lid. Sister Marie closed her eyes and prepared for the sound that would end everything. The creak of wood, the gasp of discovery, the shouts, the gunfire. She prayed for Thomas to have the strength to stay silent, even as they dragged him from the coffin. She prayed for courage to face what was coming, and then from somewhere deep inside herself, she found her voice and spoke words that would either save them all or damn them forever. Sister Marie stepped directly between Kruger and the coffin, her body blocking the soldier's access. She looked the German officer in the eyes and spoke with a conviction that surprised even herself. The deceased, she said, was not just any parishioner. He was a victim of typhus, the same disease that had killed dozens in the city over the past month. The convent had sealed the coffin immediately after death to prevent contamination. Opening it now would release airborne pathogens that could infect everyone present, including Kruger and his men. The Germans had standing orders about disease control. She had seen those directives herself when soldiers quarantined an entire city block after a tuberculosis outbreak. Was Kruger willing to risk his men's health, to risk carrying infection back to his barracks, for the sake of searching a coffin that contained nothing but a disease-riddled corpse? The lie came out smoothly, each word chosen with precision, her voice steady despite the terror screaming through her veins. She was betting everything on German fear of disease, on their obsessive protocols, on the hope that Kruger valued his own safety above absolute thoroughness. Kruger hesitated. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The dispatch in his hand ordered searches, but it said nothing about exposing his men to potentially fatal illness. The other soldiers had already taken a step back at the mention of typhus. One of them made a comment in German that Sister Marie didn't fully catch, but the tone suggested fear. Kruger looked at the coffin, then back at Sister Marie. He asked when the person had died. She answered immediately. 3 days ago. The body was already decomposing, already dangerous. Kruger's jaw tightened. He was clearly unhappy with the situation, caught between his orders and his self-preservation instinct. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, he stood there weighing his options. Then he stepped back. The funeral could proceed, he said, but they were to bury the body immediately and report the location to the health office. There would be an inspection of the gravesite later to ensure proper quarantine protocols. Sister Marie agreed to everything, her voice grateful, her hands clasped in a gesture of thanks that hid their violent trembling. The soldiers moved away from the hearse with visible relief. The barrier lifted. The procession continued forward. Sister Marie didn't allow herself to think during the remaining 8 blocks to the cemetery. If she thought about what had just happened, about how narrowly they had escaped, about Thomas suffocating in that coffin listening to the conversation that nearly exposed him, she would lose control completely. She recited prayers mechanically, one foot in front of the other, her entire being focused on reaching the cemetery before something else went wrong. The gravediggers were waiting, and this time she gave them no subtle signals. Everything proceeded as if this were a legitimate burial. They lowered the coffin into the grave. They shoveled dirt over it. Sister Marie said the final prayers over what appeared to be a freshly filled grave. Then the nuns departed, leaving the gravediggers to their work. Only after the sisters had left would Laurent and his partner exhume the coffin, pull Thomas from his temporary tomb, and rush him to the waiting resistance fighters who would take him south. The walk back to the convent happened in silence. Sister Therese walked beside Sister Marie, their shoulders occasionally touching, the only communication they could manage. When they finally passed through the convent gates, Sister Marie went directly to the chapel without speaking to anyone. She knelt before the altar and remained there for 3 hours, not praying in any formal sense, but simply existing in the presence of something larger than herself, trying to process what she had done and what she had become. She had looked a German officer in the eyes and lied with such conviction that he had believed her. She had weaponized his fear, manipulated his caution, played on his self-interest. She had saved a young man's life, but she had done it through deception that violated every instinct toward honesty her faith had instilled in her. Was this who she was now? A liar who hid behind a habit? A smuggler who used sacred rites as cover for war? Or was she something else? A soldier who fought with the only weapons available to her? A woman of faith acting on that faith in the only way this brutal world allowed? She never got a clear answer to those questions, but later that night, word came through the network. Thomas had made it safely to the countryside. He was being moved to the Spanish border. He would likely survive the war and return home to Yorkshire. Sister Marie absorbed this news with a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a profound sense of having crossed a line from which there was no return. She had promised herself this would be the last operation, but even as she made that promise, she knew it was a lie. As long as the war continued, As long as the Nazis occupied Belgium, as long as her skills could save lives and strike back against evil, she would continue. The coffins would keep moving. The checkpoints would keep being crossed. And Sister Marie would keep walking that razor's edge between faith and deception, between the vows she had taken and the war she was fighting, until liberation came, or until her luck finally, inevitably, ran out. June 6, 1944. The day the world changed. News of the Allied landings at Normandy reached Brussels through crackling radios and whispered conversations that spread through the city like wildfire. The invasion had begun. The second front was open. The German occupation, which had seemed eternal, suddenly had an expiration date. The resistance networks erupted into coordinated action. Railways were sabotaged. Communication lines were cut. German convoys were ambushed with explosives that had been stockpiled for months, explosives that had passed through checkpoints hidden in coffins, carried by a nun who had learned to lie with her eyes fixed on heaven. Sister Marie watched the city transform from the convent windows. The Germans, sensing their grip loosening, became more brutal and more desperate. Mass arrests swept through neighborhoods. Public executions increased. But underneath the terror, a current of hope ran stronger than fear. Liberation was coming. It was only a matter of time. Sister Marie continued the funeral runs through June and July, though the checkpoints were now manned by soldiers who looked increasingly haggard, who searched with the frantic energy of men who knew they were losing. The end came in September of 1944, when Allied forces finally reached Brussels. Sister Marie stood in the convent courtyard as tanks rolled down streets that had been patrolled by Germans for 4 years. The crowds that flooded into the streets were delirious with joy, waving flags, embracing soldiers, dancing in the ruins of their occupied city. The liberation was chaotic, violent in places where German holdouts refused to surrender, but overwhelmingly joyous. Sister Marie watched it all with a strange detachment, unable to fully process that it was over. The checkpoints were gone. Obersturmführer Kruger had fled the city with the retreating Wehrmacht. The hearse stood in the convent stable, empty and silent, its secret work finished. Sister Marie had made 87 funeral runs during the occupation. She had smuggled over 1,200 pounds of explosives and 3 people, including Thomas the RAF pilot, who had written her a letter from England thanking the anonymous nun who had saved his life. She never responded. Anonymity had kept her alive, and she saw no reason to abandon it now. The years after the war were quiet. Sister Marie returned to teaching at the convent school, to her routines of prayer and service, to a life that resembled the one she had lived before May 1940. But she was not the same person. She carried the weight of those 87 journeys, those moments at checkpoints when a word or a glance could have meant death, those nights preparing coffins in candlelight while the city slept. She never spoke publicly about what she had done. The resistance networks dissolved as their members returned to normal lives or tried to. Some received medals and recognition. Sister Marie received neither and wanted neither. Her reward was walking through a free Brussels, seeing children play without fear, watching her country rebuild itself from the rubble of occupation. That was enough, more than enough. In 1968, a historian researching Belgian resistance activities discovered Sister Marie's name in declassified documents. He came to the convent, now led by a new Mother Superior, and asked to speak with her. Sister Marie, 62 years old, and teaching a new generation of students, was reluctant. But the historian was persistent. He explained that stories like hers were being lost, that the heroes of the resistance were dying without their sacrifices being recorded. She finally agreed to one interview, conducted in the same garden where Mother Superior had first asked her to join the operation 26 years earlier. She spoke for 3 hours, her memories sharp and painful, describing the fear and the faith that had carried her through those years. The historian asked her if she had ever regretted her actions, if the moral cost had been too high. Sister Marie was silent for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the statue of Mary that had watched over that garden through occupation and liberation. Then she answered with the same conviction that had allowed her to lie to German officers. She had no regrets. Evil had come to her country, and she had fought it with the only weapons she had. Faith without action was empty. Love without sacrifice was meaningless. She had lived her vows more truly during those years of deception than in all her years of simple devotion. Sister Marie died in 1979 at the age of 67, surrounded by the sisters who had become her family. Her obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of coffins or checkpoints or the war that had defined her. It described a beloved teacher, a woman of faith, a servant of her community. But in the archives of Belgian resistance history, her name appears in the records of those who fought the occupation without uniforms or guns, who turned ordinary tools into weapons, who understood that sometimes the most sacred act is the one that breaks the rules to save a life. The Nazis never discovered her operation. They never learned that the quiet nun leading funeral processions had been smuggling the instruments of their destruction right past their checkpoints, that death itself had been turned against them by a woman who believed that faith demanded action and that love demanded risk. Sister Marie's story was buried for decades, lost among thousands of other acts of resistance, forgotten in the grand narrative of armies and invasions. But it was real. It happened, and it matters because it reminds us that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it walks quietly through checkpoints with a prayer book in hand and dynamite hidden in a coffin, trusting that faith and courage might be enough to survive one more day in a war that seemed like it would never end.